What happens when a woman demands half of her husband's fortune, convinced that she deserves it all? What if I told you that the judge's verdict left everyone in the courtroom stunned, including the entitled wife herself? Was justice truly served? Or did greed lead to her ultimate downfall? Ethan and Naomi Caldwell seemed like the perfect couple, wealthy, powerful, and admired by many. But behind closed doors, their marriage was far from perfect. They started out deeply in love, or so Ethan thought. He built his tech empire from scratch, believing that Naomi was by his side, supporting him through it all. But as the years passed, Naomi grew comfortable, maybe a little too comfortable. Luxury vacations, designer shopping sprees, and a lifestyle most could only dream of. Naomi had it all. But here's the twist. She never lifted a finger to build any of it. So when their marriage crumbled, Naomi didn't just want a clean break. She wanted half of everything Ethan had ever worked for. She thought she had this in the bag. After all, she played the role of the devoted wife perfectly. But what if I told you that Ethan had receipts, and that Naomi's own greed would be her biggest mistake? Because when the judge uncovered one shocking truth after another, Naomi went from confident and entitled to panicked and desperate. And by the time the final verdict was announced, she realized she had made the worst decision of her life. So, what exactly happened in that courtroom? What secrets did Naomi think she could hide? And how did her greed cost her everything? Stay tuned, because this is one story you don't want to miss. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe the channel so the community can grow and we can bring you more stories like this. Now, let's get into it. It was a stormy morning in Crestfall, a city where wealth whispered through the streets and legal battles were fought like gladiator duels in the courtroom. But today, one case stood out from the rest, a case that had everyone talking. Ethan Caldwell, a self-made millionaire, sat in the courthouse lobby, his hands clasped together as he stared ahead. He had built his fortune from the ground up, pouring his soul into Caldwell Innovations, a tech firm that had transformed the industry. But now, his wealth was on the line, all because of the woman sitting just 10 feet away, feigning distress. Across the room sat Naomi Caldwell, his soon-to-be ex-wife. She was draped in designer fashion, her long, manicured nails tapping against her expensive handbag. With striking confidence, she whispered to her attorney, Daniel Foster, a high-profile lawyer known for securing outrageous settlements. Naomi had played the role of a devoted wife for years, but now she wanted out, and she wanted half of everything Ethan owned. The courtroom doors creaked open, and a bailiff stepped forward. All rise for the Honorable Judge Miriam Lancaster. Everyone stood as Judge Lancaster, a woman known for her no-nonsense rulings, took her seat. She adjusted her glasses and surveyed the room before glancing at the stack of documents before her. "Let's get to it," she said, her voice carrying authority. "Mrs. Caldwell, you are requesting half of Mr. Caldwell's assets, including his business, correct?" Naomi offered a well-rehearsed sigh, placing a delicate hand on her chest. "Yes, Your Honor. I sacrificed everything for this marriage. I was by Ethan's side through it all. I supported his career, entertained his business partners, and gave up my own aspirations. It's only fair that I receive my share." Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew Naomi's words were laced with deception. She had never lifted a finger to support his business. Instead, she had indulged in luxury, treating his success as her endless bank account. Judge Lancaster turned her sharp gaze to Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell, your response?" Ethan straightened. "Your Honor, while I acknowledge our marriage lasted 10 years, Naomi was never involved in my company. She had access to every luxury imaginable, but she never contributed to my success. Caldwell Innovations was built with my blood, sweat, and tears, long before we even met." Naomi gasped, her eyes widening with faux betrayal. "That's a lie. I was his emotional support. That has value." Her lawyer, Daniel, interjected smoothly. Your Honor, my client's contributions may not be financial, but emotional labor is just as valuable. She deserves to be compensated accordingly. Judge Lancaster studied Naomi for a long moment. Then, with a calculated nod, she said, "Let's examine the financials, shall we?" Naomi's confidence flickered. Something told Ethan that this was about to take a turn, one Naomi never saw coming. Judge Lancaster flipped through the documents before her, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Caldwell," she began, tapping a specific page, "according to the financial statements provided, you have an independent account that has received consistent deposits over the last 6 years, totaling over $3 million. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Naomi's eyes widened and her grip on the table tightened. That money is for my personal expenses," she stammered. Judge Lancaster raised an eyebrow. $3 million in personal expenses? Mrs. Caldwell, are you suggesting that your lifestyle alone requires such an extensive amount? Ethan folded his arms, watching his ex-wife scramble for an explanation. Naomi shot a look at Daniel, who cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client was entitled to financial security during her marriage. It is not unreasonable for a spouse to maintain a level of financial independence." Judge Lancaster wasn't convinced. Financial independence is one thing. Accumulating millions while claiming dependency is another. Naomi's face paled as the judge continued. "Furthermore, records indicate that you have made multiple high-value transactions to offshore accounts. Care to explain?" Ethan's lawyer, Rebecca Holt, smirked. "Your Honor, it seems Mrs. Caldwell was ensuring her financial future long before this divorce was filed." Naomi's composure cracked. "That's not true. I was just protecting myself." Judge Lancaster sighed, looking unimpressed. "Protecting yourself while demanding half of Mr. Caldwell's estate. That does not reflect the financial dependency you are claiming." Mrs. Caldwell, Ethan, felt a surge of relief. For the first time in months, the truth was coming to light, and Naomi was running out of lies to tell. Naomi's nails dug into the wooden table as her mind raced for an escape. "Your Honor, this is being taken completely out of context," she protested. "I never hid money. I was just setting aside something for emergencies." Judge Lancaster's eyes narrowed. "Emergencies, Mrs. Caldwell. Offshore accounts don't scream emergency funds. They scream financial concealment." Daniel Foster, Naomi's attorney, cleared his throat and straightened his tie. "Your Honor, we must consider the lifestyle that my client has become accustomed to. Mr. Caldwell's wealth allowed her to live in a manner that should not be abruptly stripped away." Judge Lancaster leaned back in her chair, unimpressed. "Mr. Foster, are you suggesting that Mrs. Caldwell's comfort is more important than an honest division of assets?" Daniel hesitated. "I am merely stating that lifestyle maintenance is a key factor in divorce settlements." Ethan exhaled sharply. This entire proceeding had been a relentless attempt to paint him as some villain, withholding what was rightfully Naomi's. But the tide was turning. Judge Lancaster picked up another document. "Mr. Caldwell, can you confirm whether your wife played any role in the management or growth of Caldwell Innovations?" Ethan straightened. "She did not, Your Honor. Naomi never contributed to the business financially or strategically. The company was founded before our marriage, and every major expansion was made without her involvement." Naomi let out an incredulous laugh. "That's ridiculous. I was there. I attended every gala, every business dinner. I made you look respectable." Judge Lancaster raised an eyebrow. "So, your claim to half of Caldwell Innovations is based on socializing?" Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line, but she quickly recovered. "Image matters in business. If I hadn't been by his side, his company wouldn't be where it is today." Rebecca Holt, Ethan's lawyer, finally spoke up, her voice as smooth as silk. "Your Honor, while Mrs. Caldwell certainly enjoyed the perks of being a wealthy businessman's wife, there is no legal precedent for awarding half of a company based on attending parties." Judge Lancaster tapped her pen against her desk. "I agree." Naomi's breath hitched. But you can't just dismiss everything I did, the judge sighed. Mrs. Caldwell, this court is here to determine a fair distribution of marital assets, not to reward entitlement. Naomi's attorney leaned in, whispering something urgently in her ear. Naomi's face twisted as she listened. The fight she had walked in with was slipping through her manicured fingers. Your Honor, Daniel Foster said, my client is willing to negotiate a settlement rather than proceed with this combative approach. Naomi shot him a look of pure betrayal, but the damage was done. Judge Lancaster nodded. That would be wise. Ethan remained still, his pulse steady. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it finally felt like justice was within reach. Naomi clenched her fists under the table, her carefully maintained facade slipping. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. She had expected a victory, expected the judge to see her as the devoted wife who had sacrificed everything. Instead, her secret accounts, her offshore transactions, and her complete lack of business involvement were now out in the open. She had to salvage this. Naomi forced a shaky breath and put on her best wounded expression. Your Honor, I was simply trying to secure my future. I was afraid that if I didn't, I would be left with nothing after giving so much to this marriage. Judge Lancaster didn't so much as blink. You were securing your future while simultaneously demanding half of Mr. Caldwell's assets? She glanced back at the financial records. These deposits into your offshore accounts began 6 years ago. That doesn't indicate fear, Mrs. Caldwell. It indicates premeditation. Daniel Foster cleared his throat. Your Honor, my client acknowledges the existence of these accounts, but that does not negate the fact that she has been financially reliant on Mr. Caldwell for years. Rebecca Holt smirked. Financially reliant with $3 million stashed away? She turned to the judge. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Mrs. Caldwell was not only preparing for a divorce long before it was filed, but she was also attempting to conceal assets while claiming financial dependence. That's not equitable distribution, that's deception. Naomi's pulse quickened. This wasn't going to plan. Judge Lancaster exhaled sharply and turned back to Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, in light of this new information, are you still willing to negotiate a settlement, or do you wish to proceed with litigation? Ethan looked at his attorney, then at Naomi. He had spent years catering to her demands, years watching her manipulate every situation to her advantage. But today, the power had shifted. I'm open to negotiation, Your Honor, he said, his voice calm. But it must be fair. Naomi is not entitled to half of my business, and given her hidden assets, I believe her financial need is far less than she claims. Naomi gritted her teeth. She could feel everything slipping through her fingers. She had been so certain that she would walk out of this courtroom with a fortune, but now she was struggling just to hold on to a fraction of what she had expected. Judge Lancaster nodded. Then I will give both parties a brief recess to determine whether a settlement can be reached. The gavel struck. Naomi barely registered the sound before Daniel turned to her, his voice low and urgent. Naomi, we need to reconsider our position. If we push too hard, we could end up with much less than what we can negotiate now. Naomi wasn't listening. She was staring at Ethan, her eyes burning with fury. He was winning. He was actually winning, and she wasn't going to let that happen. Naomi stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished courtroom floor. She leaned toward Daniel, her voice a sharp whisper. We are not negotiating. We fight. Daniel sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Naomi, you don't have the leverage you think you do. The offshore accounts, the financial independence, it's all working against you. If we push too far, the judge might rule in his favor entirely. Naomi's jaw tightened. I don't care. I deserve that money. He wouldn't have his empire without me. Daniel hesitated, but before he could argue further, Ethan and Rebecca approached their table. Rebecca spoke first. We're willing to discuss a fair settlement, she said coolly, setting a folder in front of Daniel. Ethan has made a generous offer. Daniel opened the folder and scanned the document. Naomi watched as his brows lifted slightly. "$5 million?" he said, almost in disbelief. "You're willing to settle at $5 million? No strings attached?" Ethan nodded. "I want this over with. That's my final offer." Naomi snatched the document from Daniel's hands, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the numbers. $5 million? That was a fraction of what she had planned to walk away with. It wasn't enough. She scoffed, slamming the folder shut. "Absolutely not," she spat. "I'm entitled to half of everything. I was your wife for 10 years. I'm not walking away with some pathetic settlement like I'm some gold digger you can pay off." Rebecca smirked. "That's funny, because your bank records tell a different story." Naomi's nostrils flared. "Go to hell." Judge Lancaster re-entered the courtroom, and the bailiff called for order. "Have the parties reached a settlement?" the judge asked. Rebecca glanced at Naomi before responding. "No, Your Honor, Mrs. Caldwell has rejected Mr. Caldwell's offer." Judge Lancaster sighed and leaned forward. "Mrs. Caldwell, do you understand what you're risking by refusing a settlement? Given the evidence presented, this court has the authority to make a ruling that may leave you with far less than the $5 million on the table." Naomi lifted her chin defiantly. "I don't accept scraps, Your Honor. I want my fair share." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. She really thought she was invincible. Judge Lancaster pursed her lips. "Very well. Since a settlement has not been reached, I will render my verdict." The room fell into a tense silence. Naomi's confidence wavered for the first time as the judge gathered the papers before her. Based on the financial evidence provided, it is clear that Mrs. Caldwell has independently secured significant assets over the years and is not in need of half of Mr. Caldwell's fortune. Furthermore, her attempts to conceal funds raise serious ethical concerns. Naomi's stomach dropped. The judge continued. "As such, the court denies Mrs. Caldwell's request for half of Mr. Caldwell's estate." The air left Naomi's lungs. Naomi sat frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Denied? The word rang in her ears like a deafening gong. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Judge Lancaster continued, her voice firm. "Furthermore, given the financial deception displayed in this case, this court finds it appropriate to reassess Mrs. Caldwell's overall settlement entitlement." Naomi's hands clenched into fists. Reassess? What did that mean? The judge flipped to another document. Taking into account Mrs. Caldwell's secret accounts, offshore transactions, and the fact that Mr. Caldwell's business was established prior to the marriage, the court finds that a 50-50 division of assets is unwarranted. Instead, the court awards Mrs. Caldwell. She paused for a moment, letting the tension settle over the room. Naomi's heart pounded. $1 million as a final settlement, with no further claims to Mr. Caldwell's business or future earnings. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Naomi shot up from her chair, her face flushed red with fury. "What?" she shrieked. Rebecca Holt hid a satisfied smirk, while Ethan simply exhaled, relief washing over him. The nightmare was almost over. Naomi turned on her lawyer. "Fix this! Do something!" she hissed. Daniel Foster, however, looked utterly defeated. He shook his head. "Naomi, this is over." "The judge has ruled." Judge Lancaster lifted her gavel. "This court is adjourned." Bang! The sound of the gavel striking the wood was the final blow. Naomi staggered, her breath coming in short, erratic gasps. $1 million. $1 million. That was nothing compared to what she had expected, what she deserved. Ethan stood, buttoning his jacket. He turned to Naomi one last time, his expression unreadable. "You should have taken the $5 million." Naomi's nails dug into her palms, her entire plan, her years of scheming, all for nothing. As the courtroom emptied, Naomi remained frozen in place. She had walked in expecting to leave as a wealthy, victorious woman. Instead, she had lost everything: her credibility, her leverage, and her golden payday. Daniel quietly packed up his files. "I'll be in touch," he muttered before leaving. Naomi was alone. No settlement to boast about, no lavish future ahead of her, just a single million, barely a fraction of what she had spent over the years. Her eyes flickered to Ethan, who was now shaking hands with Rebecca. He looked free. And Naomi, she was nothing. Naomi stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. She couldn't believe it. $1 million? That was chump change compared to what she had planned to walk away with. This was supposed to be her moment, her victory. Ethan was supposed to leave this courtroom in ruins, begging for financial mercy. Instead, it was her world that had come crashing down. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, eager for a statement. Naomi barely had time to adjust her expression before microphones were shoved in her face. "Mrs. Caldwell, how do you feel about the judge's ruling? Do you believe you were treated unfairly? Are you going to appeal?" Naomi swallowed back her rage and forced a thin-lipped smile. She wouldn't let the world see her fall apart. "No comment," she said stiffly, pushing past the crowd. Meanwhile, Ethan stepped out behind her, walking tall, his shoulders squared. The cameras flashed, but he didn't stop for interviews. He was done with the spectacle, with Naomi, with everything she had put him through. Rebecca Holt turned to him as they reached the steps. "That went even better than expected," she mused. "I imagine she'll try to spin this into some kind of victim narrative." Ethan exhaled, watching Naomi disappear into a waiting car. "Let her," he said simply. "I don't care anymore." And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. 3 months later. Naomi scrolled through her phone, her lips pressed into a thin line. Every social event, every elite party she had once been a staple at, she was now excluded from. Her so-called friends had distanced themselves, no longer interested in someone who had lost her golden ticket. Worse, her lavish spending habits had caught up to her, the $1 million settlement she had sneered at. It was disappearing fast. No more first-class flights, no more designer shopping sprees, no more 5-star vacations. She had gone from queen of high society to a cautionary tale in a matter of weeks. Her lawyer had advised against an appeal. There was no case to fight. She had lost, and there was no undoing it. Her stomach twisted as she scrolled past an article about Ethan's latest business expansion. He was thriving, moving forward without her. And she? She was stuck, drowning in the consequences of her own greed. For the first time, an unsettling realization crept in. She had been given a chance, a generous $5 million. Had she swallowed her pride and accepted it, she could have walked away wealthy, comfortable, free. But she wanted it all, and in the end, she had walked away with nothing. So what can you take away from this? In life, there are 2 types of people, builders and takers. Builders are the ones who put in the work, make sacrifices, and create something out of nothing. Ethan was a builder. He spent years building his company, securing his future, and working for every dollar he had. Then there are takers. People like Naomi. They don't build, they expect. They convince themselves that just because they were present, they are somehow entitled to the rewards. But life doesn't reward entitlement. It rewards strategy, effort, and honesty. Naomi walked into that courtroom thinking she had it all figured out. She believed that manipulation, lies, and a sense of entitlement would secure her a fortune. But what she didn't realize was that the real power always belongs to those who come prepared, those who move with strategy, and those who let facts, not emotions, speak for them. Ethan didn't fight with anger. He didn't crumble under the pressure. He let the truth do the work. Because here's the thing. Greed can make you reckless. Entitlement can make you blind. But strategy? Strategy always wins. Naomi had a golden opportunity, a generous $5 million settlement. She could have walked away rich, but she let her greed, her arrogance, and her false sense of power lead her to complete destruction. The The moment she rejected that offer, she had already lost. She thought she was playing the system, but in the end, the system played her. If you ever find yourself in a battle, whether it's in business, relationships, or life, never act on entitlement, greed, or raw emotion, because those who think they're untouchable are always the ones who fall the hardest. Instead, be the one who comes prepared. Be the one with a strategy. Be the one who plays the long game, because in the real world, the smartest player, not the loudest one, always wins. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notification to be the first to know when interesting and lesson-packed stories like this one drop.